It's almost impossible to know for sure, but the fact is that despite the prevarication, years and years of negotiation, it was proven that Iran had a lot of very highly enriched uranium, well beyond the level of enrichment that you ever need for the programs that Iran claimed it was for. And therefore, the logical corollary was that their ambition remained to get a nuclear weapon. And Trump was very clear, we cannot allow that to happen.
Hello, welcome to the Trump Report. Today there is so much to discuss with Iran. Usually we do an emergency episode on the weekends, but we couldn't make it work yesterday, so we're kind of just doing a big analysis of what has happened in the last few days. My guest today is Sean Bell, retired Air Vice Marshal, former fighter pilot and military analyst. Sean, thank you so much for coming on the Trump Report today.
It's a great pleasure, Maddie. Thanks for having me.
Let's go through what happened on Saturday for anyone who really wants a breakdown of the situation that did unfold between the US, Israel, and Iran. So can you walk me through Operation Epic Fury? How did it work? How long does it feel like it was planned under the guise that the US and Iran had been orchestrating these diplomatic discussions to end Iran's nuclear enrichment program?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. We probably don't have time to go through the whole of that, but in big handfuls. There's been a lot of criticism that obviously the US and Iran were in a bunch of talks. There had been 3 rounds of talks, and they were planning to have another set a few days later. So there was a bit of an uproar that suddenly this military action happened. It is worth putting into context that I think it was in May last year, the US and Iran had 5 rounds of talks. A 6th round of talks was scheduled, but that was cancelled, and that's when the Operation Midnight Hammer happened. Because Iran has a long history of just playing these things long, agreeing to talks, but actually not agreeing to anything substantive. And so, therefore, whilst there had been 3 lots of talks, it was pretty obvious to the US side, I think, that Iran was just playing this long. They had no intention of doing anything and thought that the danger was that Trump was just bluffing. And so, undoubtedly, the planning for this, I think, has been going on for some time. What I think is fascinating, purely from a military perspective, is when we saw the Tomahawk missiles launched, when we saw the bombs raining down, it was daylight. Now, I'm grey-haired and old. I've been a veteran of lots of campaigns. You generally start these things at 2 or 3 in the morning, because unless you're a night shift, you're fast asleep. Most people are pretty groggy at that time of day, and you have shock and awe by doing it at night. Why did it therefore happen in the morning, about 9:30 local time in Iran? And what seems to have happened is the Americans said, we're going to roll back the Iranian air defense systems, and we're going to go after the nuclear enrichment facilities. If you, Israel, because you have exceptional intelligence about Iran, you're going to go after the Iranian leadership. Because you'll remember with Hezbollah up to the north, Israel decimated Hezbollah with those walkie-talkies because they'd infiltrated the whole organization. So, and what appears to have happened on the day, America and Israel decided, yep, next time we get an opportunity, we're going to go in. Israel suddenly went, right, we now have a window of opportunity when we've identified all the key figures. We know where they are. We need to go now. And therefore, it sounds like they precipitated it all starting outside the normal window of nighttime. And as we now know, even though the Ayatollah normally would be moving around a lot, he would have suspected he'd be a target. It does appear that a whole load of the senior leadership have been taken out almost on day one. Now, what happens next then is, I think, fascinating, because people like me, the military action is only a means to an end. The political end state is why you do this. So the rhetorical question is, so what did President Trump actually want to achieve? And he sounded like he wanted regime change. Well, he's just killed all the senior figures of the regime. Tick. So what about this stop them ever having a nuclear weapon? Well, it's not entirely clear to me that you're going to be able to use air power alone to stop them ever having a nuclear weapon. So I sort of expected the war would stop after a short, sharp shock. We've demonstrated intent. Iran, if you don't come to the table now and are serious, you've now seen what we're going to do. How wrong was I? That military campaign has continued. And yesterday, we saw the Israelis, I think it was 1,200 bombs dropped, largely in the Tehran region, taking out Ministry of Defense headquarters, more leadership targets. Not entirely clear what the Americans are targeting at the moment. And there is a suggestion that the American objective and the Israeli objective may now be diverging. Been interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, well, let's get into that. We saw Israel's defense minister warn Lebanon's Hezbollah chief that he is now the next target for elimination. Does that kind of indicate to you that the US and Israel's objectives are diverging, where we'll see Israel try to push the US into a wider Middle Eastern war?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always careful about trying to navigate my way around politics a bit more carefully. But of course, ultimately, I got sent to war several times with our nation on the behest of the political masters. And you want to be really clear what they're trying to achieve and whether it's achievable. So, for example, with President Trump, regime change sounds great. But if you look back in history, our efforts in Libya, that didn't really work. Our efforts in Iraq, that didn't really work. So it's very difficult to see how you can achieve that objective through purely military means. But it did look as if President Trump was appealing to the Iranian people to rise up. So that's a particular agenda. What's clear from Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel, they see this potentially as a once in a lifetime opportunity to actually finally get rid of the threat of Iran to them. And also, they've now mobilized, I believe, another 100,000 reservists as well. They've moved some of those up to the border with Lebanon, but there's also a lot going to the West Bank. And it'll be really interesting to see if they now decide that they're going to push the boundaries of Israel out wider, given the fact they see this as a unique opportunity to re-establish a different border for Israel as a result of this conflict.
Is this war on Iran reckless from Trump, knowing the ripple effect that it could have had, well, it has had on, further strikes we've seen Dubai, Oman, etc., receiving retaliation because of it? Or was this a situation where it was now or never and it was time to take out the world's axis of evil?
Yeah, if only the world was quite as binary in black and white like that. I think it's too early to judge at the moment. If Iran, in the next couple of days, starts to negotiate and President Trump does achieve a negotiated settlement to getting rid of the nuclear threat from Iran, then he'll be hailed as a savior because it was not something anybody was able to do. I do think there is slightly more disturbing, which we can get into. It's that America seems to be now distancing itself from international law. It went into Venezuela and plucked Maduro out. It's gone into Iran and, and killed all senior leadership without ever going to the United Nations, without ever looking at the implications for international law. Now, the so what of that is, okay, so what does China now take away from this with its view on Taiwan? Why would Russia think twice now about just keep pushing into Ukraine? Are there other nations that are big and strong enough to go, we don't have to adhere to international law? Because if the big boy on the block, America, doesn't adhere to it, why should we? And for our country, I think that has profound implications because, as one of the Canadians said, if this is the major powers bullying their way around the world, if you're not a major power sat at the table, you're on the menu. And we as a nation find ourselves in the latter now.
We haven't really heard much, Sean, from Trump on Operation Epic Fury. We haven't heard much from the Vice President either. And really, if the US had successfully, obliterated the nuclear capabilities the way he said so last June. But does the United States have proof that Iran was enriching uranium to such a dangerous rate? Because we saw Republican Senator Ted Cruz say, I have no indication that they were anywhere close to getting a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, I mean, the danger here is it's a great question, but we'll never know the answer to it because if you are, let's spin this back slightly. Ever since Ukraine was the third largest nuclear power in the world on the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1994, America, the UK, and Russia persuaded Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons in return for a guarantee of its own security, called the Budapest Memo of 1994. 20 years later, Putin ripped that up and he went into Ukraine. there is definitely a view that if Ukraine still had nuclear weapons, Russia would never have dared to attack. So what? It means that ultimately nuclear weapons are the only guarantee of a nation's security. So a country like Iran probably feels it's the only way it can guarantee its security. And therefore, whatever anybody else thinks, it's going to bluff, it's going to bluster, it's going to lie, but it is going to continue developing a weapon because by the time it's done it, it's too late for everybody else to do anything about it. Intelligence, particularly Israeli intelligence, as we've seen over the last few days, is embedded deep within Iran and Hezbollah and its proxies. And the analysis there said that Iran was getting closer and closer and closer to the day it had a nuclear weapon. If it actually had a nuclear weapon, suddenly that's an existential threat to Israel and probably a lot of other nations in the region. So going back to your question, it's almost impossible to know for sure. But the fact is that despite the prevarication, years and years of negotiation, it was proven that Iran had a lot of very highly enriched uranium, well beyond the level of enrichment that you ever need for the programs that Iran claimed it was for. And therefore, the logical corollary was that their ambition remained to get a nuclear weapon. And Trump was very clear, we cannot allow that to happen.
Sean, you mentioned kind of this decision to strike when the US struck, and it was in conjunction with this intelligence that pointed Israel and the United States to where Ali Khamenei was. So just for our audience to kind of understand how this unfolded, Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, he was killed on Saturday afternoon. The New York Times reported that the US and Israel had been targeting Iran's leadership after months of intelligence tracking. And right before the attacks occurred, the CIA had identified the location of him. So can you walk me through this level of intelligence and what it really says about the military capability, intelligence capabilities of the United States paired with Israel if they were able to, kill the Supreme Leader within hours of the strikes beginning? Because Andrew Neil, he tweeted that the key development from this was that they'd learned that a meeting of the top Iranian officials would take place Saturday morning at a leadership compound in the heart of Tehran, and the Supreme Leader would be at that site. Intel passed to Israel, jets dispatched to the bomb site. So we could say, some people say that this was done on a whim, but it also seems as if this was a clear plan.
I have no doubt it was a clear plan. And I would not underestimate, you and I, we walk around with mobile phones routinely in our pockets. Our cars are connected. Our computers are connected. Once you know how to manipulate that, we are in a world where we've never been so carefully surveillanced, that we can be easily tracked through our social media, everything. Once you now take that to a different level, which America has, not only eyes, ears, but the electromagnetic spectrum, you can do all sorts of things. And there's no doubt that over time, as Israel demonstrated with Hezbollah, when they had all of the Hezbollah leadership with walkie-talkies, with explosives, how on earth did they do that? Well, it was only by actually embedding themselves in, breeding a sense of confidence that, for example, in Hezbollah, now in Iran, that they can operate with relative freedom. But actually, you're tracking them all the time. And I think the key here is once you pull the pin, once you attack, what you've forced Iran to do is to go onto different communications networks. They suddenly don't trust. They set up a new network, and suddenly you lose some of that access. So in a way, this was probably years in the planning. In a way, now that it's been enacted, Iran will be a lot more careful. It'll be some years, I suspect, before you can get the same sort of access again.
Speaking of years, ABC's Jonathan Karl, he tweeted in another phone call this evening, President Trump told me about the death of Ayatollah Khamenei. He said, I got him before he got me. They tried twice. Well, I got him first. That's a reference to US intelligence believing there was a plot to kill Trump in 2024. So just for our audience to understand, what we know that is in 2024, around the time of the first assassination attempt at Donald Trump when he was at Butler, there were reports that Iran was plotting Trump's death. Now, of course, Iran wasn't responsible for this assassination attempt, but there was still reports going around that Iran was plotting an assassination. So there is still no public evidence that this is true. But is there a reason to believe, Sean, that intelligence thought that these threats were getting stronger and stronger and prompted the White House, prompted Trump to take out Khamenei?
I think, again, there are lots of conspiracy theories about, and I also know that sometimes people put out stories to justify their actions. I do not operate in the security services. When I was involved in some of the areas of here, there are so many games and tricks being played that it's very difficult to know what to believe here. What you've got to remember is America didn't go to the United Nations to attack Iran. They didn't justify it legally in international law. So what they are, I suspect, doing is trying to put out a load of information that appears to justify why it's a credible thing for them to do. How much that is true, how much that is simply trying to reinforce their narrative, because it is very worrying, as we've already talked about, to me, that we've suddenly created a landscape where the big superpowers can largely do what they like. And I think that's fundamentally very worrying for the rest of the world.
Do you think this attack on Iran is the reason as to why the US was so apprehensive in giving Ukraine Tomahawk missiles and Patriot air defense batteries, knowing that there was a chance that conflict in Iran could potentially escalate in the coming months?
I'm not sure you can make that link, but certainly there are a limited number of weapons. I mean, America is the only global superpower, and even it has only got limited supplies of these weapons. By way of example, the Patriot missile system is a very effective way of shooting down ballistic missiles out of the sky and cruise missiles. They've also got another system called THAAD, but just one Patriot system, including its missiles, is about $1 billion. There's not that many of these about. Several of them, as you say, have gone across to Ukraine. Some are in NATO countries to try and protect those as well. There's a limited number of these missiles, and you can't just nip down to Walmart and buy a few more. So inevitably, these stockpiles will be running low. And I think the key for me is almost certainly Iran has more ballistic missiles than America has defensive missiles to shoot them down. And one of the reasons, therefore, if I was a military advisor to Trump, I'd be saying you've got to go after these missile launchers in Iran. You've also got to go after the factories that are producing them and also after their stockpiles, because you've got to stop them getting launched, because once they're launched, we're now relying on a very, very small and diminishing stock of missiles.
On the note of costs, Sean, there is, of course, no official cost of how much the US has spent on Operation Epic Fury. It is estimated that it could be costing around $30 million per day. If this escalates into a full-scale war, how do you think the US taxpayer will feel about paying for a war like this? And do you think that the US will be up to it?
Well, first of all, I think 30 million sounds a very conservative number. We did some running some analysis on Russian strikes on Ukraine, and you very quickly get to $1 billion a day. I mean, ballistic missiles, often a million, £2 million a shot. Drones, £20,000 a time. Top end drones, a lot more than that. Very quickly, it's a huge amount of money. I think that'll be less the concern here. I think what we're seeing overnight is the spike in oil prices, because that will affect everybody, and how long that spike in oil price stays. And the unintended consequences, Russia's invaded Ukraine. Its economy was getting driven down because we were setting a maximum price they could get for oil, i.e. discounted on the main rate. As soon as the oil price goes up, Russia's making more money. Their economy is stronger. Therefore, they're more able to sustain their fight in Ukraine. There's all sorts of unintended consequences of this if the war continues. And I think that's one of the reasons why, for all sorts of reasons, Trump apparently has said that, it'll be over in about 4 weeks. But it's very difficult to see. The longer this goes on, the more likely American casualties, the more likely the midterm elections get compromised, the more likely these unintended consequences start affecting Americans and more widely. And that's where I think it'll be quite difficult to sustain it.
Do you believe this 4-week deadline that it will be wrapped up in around 4 weeks, Sean?
Well, no, because I don't see how there's a military answer to creating a regime change. You can write down Iran's equipment, you can write down its aircraft, its ships, but you can't write down the IRGC. There's 1 million+ people. They're the people controlling the population. So it becomes a zero-sum game. You can keep piling stuff in. Iran just doesn't. It won't win, but it can't. As long as it doesn't lose, it's fine. And as long as it keeps throwing stuff at America, okay, 99 missiles may get shot down. It only needs one to get through. We've heard the tragic death of 3 American servicemen so far. We've seen 3 US jets get shot down earlier today by Kuwait friendly fire. The longer these things go on, the attack against the sovereign air base at Cyprus, these things, it only takes one lucky strike and suddenly the casualty list starts to grow and the popularity starts to wane.
Do you see this turning into an all-out war in the Middle Eastern region?
No, I mean, I've just been on a series of briefs, and I think I was really interested because you're seeing the Saudi oil field set ablaze. There was a hotel that was hit, and there was a suggestion actually Iran is starting to fire missiles at all its neighboring countries, and you go, I think you've got to be careful there because I go to Ukraine regularly, and there are lots of blocks of flats that have been hit, but when you look at them closely, you go, no, this is a missile that's been shot down. As it hits the ground, it explodes, and therefore it causes a lot of damage, but it doesn't hit the target it was intended for. And I think at the moment we're seeing lots of devastation around on the ground. I think we're going to see that continue. The snag, I think, will be when Iran runs short of its ballistic missiles. I think we're going to see a much more increased use of the proxies, and of course that it looks likely, for example, that the strike that happened at Cyprus, I understand actually, I thought it had hit the runway. Apparently it hit a hangar, a rocket, but it didn't have an explosive charge on it. And it does appear to have come from the Lebanon. So therefore that was a Hezbollah rocket that was sent over. I think we might see more of that, even to the point of those proxies coming to the UK and start to carry out terrorist acts here. That's the worry.
You say that. Is that why you think Keir Starmer went back on his word when he told the US that they couldn't use UK military bases such as Diego Garcia, and then just a few days later he said that they could?
Yeah, for my purpose, I think America hadn't made the justification of why their attack into Iran was legitimate under international law. I'm not a legal expert, but I spent quite a lot of time in the military, and international law doesn't discriminate with somebody who does the bombing to somebody who helps them do the bombing by either providing military basing or doing air-to-air fueling. You're equally complicit. So if we're not convinced there's a legal basis for this, why would we be allowed to be bullied into helping America and therefore becoming culpable? Why is that important? It's because the one thing Iran has in spades is these missiles, ballistic missiles. Now, if you read the manuals and Wikipedia, it says that those can't reach the UK. I beg to differ. There are a series of their missiles that can reach the UK. They can't yet reach America. So America can hit Iran with knowing that it's safe. We can't. And just imagine we have no defenses in this country against ballistic missiles, not a single defense. And therefore, imagine, I guess you're sitting in London, if you knew there was a missile coming your way, and knew there was nothing that could be done to stop it, that would be terrifying. That is the reason I think Sir Keir Starmer decided to stop America. Now that our forces are being attacked as well, international law suddenly gives us the right to self-defense. And I think that's why he's changed his advice.
I want to get your thoughts on regime change, Sean, because before this strike happened on the weekend, there were still questions over really what was the motive behind threats to Iran. Was it a regime change? Was it nuclear capabilities, or was it both? And what we seem to have found is that it was more so about regime change from the Trump administration. So I wonder, can Iran have a regime change with the help of the United States via air power, via navy, via military forces without boots on the ground? We know that Trump will be incredibly apprehensive about putting boots on the ground, but does a regime change, a swift one, does it require that?
I think, first of all, I think it's very difficult for an external military to enact regime change. Secondly, I would just quiz you that I'm not sure that it was Trump's intent. There are often symptoms and diseases. I think the disease here is President Trump. America's the strategic guarantor of security for Israel, and nuclear weapon would be an existential threat to Israel. Therefore, we've got to go in and stop them having a nuclear weapon. We've been talking for ages, hasn't worked. They're getting closer. We've got to do something about it. And Trump said as much. We cannot allow them to have a nuclear weapon. I think that's the bottom line of his intent. Part of the symptoms or how he was going to do that was to threaten the regime and say, if you won't negotiate, you're going to be wiped out. So I can actually get a big bunch of people in there who are prepared to negotiate, and threaten them that, like any politician, Their first priority is to get re-elected, and the regime wants to stay in power because that's how it gets its money and its resources. And therefore, the threat of regime change suddenly goes to the very heart of Ayatollah Khamenei and his team about paranoia, trying to force them to negotiate. But I don't think America's ultimate role is to regime change. I think their ultimate was to make sure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon.
Sean, just a final question. Vladimir Putin, he called the killing of Khamenei and his family members cynical murder that violated human morality and international law. Putin has now lost Assad, he's lost Maduro, he's now lost Khamenei in just 1 year. Would he be worried about his own safety? But does it also say that the Moscow-Tehran axis, I mean, is it falling?
Well, there's a lot in that, isn't there? My net effect of this is that the rules-based structure, you're clearly not old enough. I'm not quite old enough to remember that, at the end of the Second World War, 70 million people had died. And so institutions like NATO, the United Nations, International Criminal Court were all developed to try and find a way to avert wars long before they happened. And we had a sort of common framework of what law looked like. Over the years, that's gradually been eroded. And of course, particularly now, we have Russia on the United Nations Security Council with a veto, and yet they have invaded another country in direct contravention. The point being is that now it's making a mockery of this rules-based order because only a few people are now adhering to it. So we need a different model that's going forward. I think in a way, however, it saddens me, these actions are now saying, right, it's now time to find a different rules-based order. And at the moment, my worry is that, of course, America is looking west. We're going to worry about our own interests there. China, National Security Council, is going to look after the east. Where does that leave Middle Earth? Where does that leave? And there is a suggestion from Trump. It's between Russia and Europe to decide what that future looks like. And there's a lot of European countries that are going, hang on a minute, we've lived under the security of NATO. If you take America out of that, we're not the United States of Europe. We're a bunch of individual countries. We've got to get our act together. And I think that's the really interesting point. So I think Putin will feel emboldened by this. It does explain why President Trump hasn't alienated Putin, has almost embraced him, because he's just seen him as almost an extension of America. We're doing what we want, you're doing what you want, but I just want to try and stop it to try and help Ukraine, rather than being you're wrong under international law. So I do think it's a different rules-based order. I think we're seeing a profound change in the way that international security is managed, and that has implications because at the moment we are incredibly vulnerable as an isolated nation.
Sean Bell, retired Air Vice Marshal, former fighter pilot and military analyst. Thank you so much for joining the Truck Report.
You're very, very welcome.